The automatic doors slid open with a faint hiss. A tall man in an expensive suit walked in, polished shoes echoing against the linoleum floor. He held a check already signed, ready to make another public donation that would earn him applause and photographs. But the moment his eyes scanned the room, something inside him froze. In the corner, near a dusty window, sat an elderly woman. Her back was slightly bent, her hands trembling as she adjusted a thin grey blanket over her lap. For a second, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. 30 years had passed, 30 years without a trace, and yet her eyes, those same deep eyes that once looked at him with warmth, now tired and dim, staring back at him across the silent hall. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Even the receptionist behind the desk noticed the sudden shift in his expression. The millionaire's chest rose and fell, his composure cracking as his hand slowly slipped the check back into his pocket. He wasn't here for charity anymore. He was here because fate had dragged him into a moment he never expected. His name was Richard Hale, a man whose face appeared regularly on magazine covers and business news networks. To the public, he was a symbol of wealth and power, a man who had built an empire of real estate towers that scraped the skies of New York. But Richard had another side, one few people ever saw. For years, he carried a private wound, a story he never told, not even to the closest people around him. His mother had vanished from his life 3 decades ago, swallowed by circumstances he could never fully explain. He had grown up bitter, blaming her absence for his cold heart and relentless drive for success. Now, standing in the nursing home, the irony cut deep. He had only come here for a photo opportunity, to polish his image with a generous donation. But the sight of that fragile woman in the corner struck like lightning. Could it be her? After all these years, he remembered the curve of her hands, the way she used to hum when cooking, the voice that once sang him to sleep. The resemblance was undeniable, but so was the fear. If it truly was his mother, why was she here abandoned in this forgotten place? Richard tried to move, but his legs felt like stone. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave before the truth shattered what little peace he had built for himself. Around him, the nursing home was alive with faint sounds, a television playing in the background, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the soft chatter of elderly voices. Yet none of it registered. His entire world narrowed to that woman by the window. He glanced at the staff members. Some smiled politely, others eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. They had seen donors before, but none who entered like this, stiff, pale, as if walking into a nightmare. The woman lifted her head slightly, as though sensing his gaze. Her lips parted. For a second, Richard thought he heard a whisper too faint to catch. The room seemed to darken, the weight of 30 years pressing down on his shoulders. If this was truly his mother, then every wall he had built, every deal he had closed, every trophy of wealth he had collected, would mean nothing. And for the first time in decades, Richard Hale felt fear. Richard forced a smile, the kind he had perfected at board meetings and charity galas. He adjusted his tie, straightened his shoulders, and pretended he hadn't just seen a ghost. "Mr. Hale, welcome," the director of the nursing home said, stepping forward with a handshake that lingered too long. Cameras from a local paper were already positioned by the entrance. They expected a performance. Richard nodded mechanically, his jaw tight. His mind, however, refused to follow the script. Every time he looked past the director's shoulder, his eyes landed on the woman near the window. She wasn't clapping or smiling like the others. She simply watched him, expression unreadable, as though measuring his soul. His heart pounded. He swallowed hard and pulled the check from his pocket again. His hand trembled. The director ushered him into the common room. A handful of residents gathered, clapping slowly, their frail hands creating a hollow sound that echoed off the pale walls. A photographer snapped pictures, capturing Richard as he handed over the oversized check. "Your generosity keeps this place alive," the director announced. The staff nodded. Cameras flashed, but Richard barely heard a word. His gaze flickered constantly to the woman in the corner. She wasn't clapping. She wasn't smiling. She simply stared at him with eyes that dug into his chest. For a moment her lips moved again, just slightly. This time he was sure of it. A name, maybe, his name? The applause died down, but Richard's ears still rang. His mask of composure was cracking, and everyone could see it. The crowd began to disperse, staff leading some residents back to their rooms. The director gestured toward Richard, eager to give him a tour of the facility. But Richard shook his head. "I need a moment," he muttered. His polished shoes carried him slowly across the room. Every step felt heavier, as though the air itself resisted him. The woman sat motionless, her gaze unwavering. Finally, he stopped just a few feet away. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. The lines on her face were deeper, her hair thinner, but the structure, the eyes, they hadn't changed. Richard's throat tightened. "It can't be," he whispered under his breath. The woman tilted her head, studying him. Then, with a fragile voice that cracked like old paper, she said a single word: "Richard." The world fell silent. The single word shattered him. It wasn't just the sound of his name, it was the way it was spoken. Soft, uncertain, almost fragile, but carrying a familiarity that dug into his bones. He hadn't heard that voice in 30 years, not since the night she disappeared. For decades, he convinced himself he'd forgotten it, buried it under steel and glass, under contracts and boardrooms. Yet here it was, piercing through the armor he had spent a lifetime building. Richard's lips parted, but no words came out. His chest felt tight, as if the walls of the nursing home were closing in. Around them, life went on. Nurses pushing wheelchairs, residents shuffling past, the hum of the air conditioner rattling in the background. But for Richard, the world had collapsed into this single moment. His instinct was to deny it, to convince himself it was a trick, a coincidence, a cruel resemblance. But when her trembling hand lifted, reaching slightly toward him, something inside him cracked, his vision blurred. He hadn't cried since he was a child, but now his eyes burned. He opened his mouth, forcing out the question he dreaded most. "Mother, is it you?" The woman blinked slowly, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. Her lips trembled, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Richard, frozen in place, felt a storm surge inside his mind. Suddenly, memories he had buried clawed their way to the surface. The smell of fresh bread on Sunday mornings, the hum of an old radio in their kitchen, the warmth of her hands holding his as she whispered promises that the world would one day be kinder. And then, the night of her disappearance. He remembered the shouting, the slammed door, the confusion of being left behind. He had told himself over the years that she abandoned him, that she chose a life without him. That belief had fueled his rage, his hunger for power, his refusal to ever be vulnerable again. But now, seeing her fragile body in this place, he wasn't so sure. 30 years, she whispered, her voice breaking. 30 years without my boy. The words pierced him like knives. He staggered back slightly, running a hand across his face, trying to steady himself. His empire, his billions, his reputation, none of it meant anything in this moment. He was just a son, face to face with the ghost of his past. The silence stretched between them, heavier than any boardroom confrontation Richard had ever faced. Around them, the nursing home buzzed with small details, the rhythmic beeping of a medical machine, the faint laughter of 2 residents playing cards, the squeak of rubber soles on the polished floor. But none of it mattered. The only sound Richard heard was the pounding of his own heart. He wanted to ask her everything. Where she had gone, why she left, why she never came back. But his throat locked up, refusing to cooperate. For years, he had rehearsed this confrontation in his mind, imagining what he would say if he ever saw her again. In every version he was strong, cold, unforgiving. But now, faced with the reality of her fragile form, he was powerless. Finally, he managed to whisper, "Why?" The woman's shoulders trembled. She lowered her gaze, fingers tightening around the blanket on her lap. Tears slid down her cheeks, silent and unstoppable. "Not here," she murmured. "Please, not in front of them." Richard followed her eyes and noticed the others watching. Residents, staff, even the director, all frozen in curiosity. Some had tears in their eyes, though they didn't know the story. They only knew they were witnessing something raw, something sacred. Richard nodded once. He wasn't ready for the answers. Not yet. The director approached cautiously, confusion etched on his face. "Mr. Hale, would you like to see the private facilities?" he asked, trying to smooth over the tension. Richard didn't respond at first. His eyes stayed locked on the woman. His mother, 30 years gone, now sitting before him in a worn-out chair in a forgotten corner of a nursing home. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Yes, a private room, please." His voice was firm, but it cracked at the edges. The director gestured toward a hallway. Richard extended a trembling hand to the woman. She hesitated, as if unsure whether to take it. Then slowly she placed her frail fingers in his. Her touch was colder than he remembered, but the connection was undeniable. Together, they walked down the hallway. Each step felt like a march into uncharted territory. Richard's mind raced, anger, guilt, relief, all colliding in chaos. Behind them, whispers spread through the common room. Residents leaned toward one another, staff exchanged glances. Everyone sensed they had just witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary. The door closed behind Richard and his mother. The questions that haunted him for 30 years pressed in with suffocating force. Now there would be no escape. The private room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon cleaner. Sunlight slipped through the blinds in thin stripes, laying pale bars across the floor. Richard eased his mother into the chair by the window and took the opposite seat, knees almost touching, but not quite. He could feel the presence of the director hovering in the hall, a shadow behind frosted glass. "Give us a minute," Richard said, not turning his head. The door clicked shut. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was crowded with years that refused to yield. Richard studied the details he had been afraid to look at in the common room. The small scar near her eyebrow, the tremor that ran through her fingers, the way she braced each breath as if it had weight. "I thought you were gone," he said. The words were flat, like a statement to a courtroom. "I thought you chose to be." Her eyes lifted to his, uncertain and bright. "I never chose that." The sentence arrived in pieces, voice frayed at the edges. "Not once." Richard leaned forward, elbows on his thighs, hands locked. "Then tell me something true. Tell me anything that will keep me from walking out of here and pretending I never saw you," she swallowed. "You always hated carrots. I grated them so fine you wouldn't notice in the sauce." A tired smile flashed and faded. "The radio broke, but we pretended it still played, remember? We hummed along to nothing." Richard felt the floor tilt under him. Memory was a door, creaking open. "Why here? Why now? 30 years is not a crack in a calendar. It's a lifetime." "I was lost," she said, and the word didn't sound dramatic, only precise. "I got sick. I forgot names, my own, yours. People helped where they could. And then one morning it all came back like bright glass. But by then," she looked at her hands, "by then I was here." Outside, a cart rattled past. A nurse's laugh traveled down the corridor, human and ordinary, in a way that made the room feel more fragile. Richard cleared his throat. "No cameras," he said. "No press. I'll handle that." He reached for the call button and asked for privacy, his voice stripped of the performance he wore in public. His mother nodded once. "Thank you," she whispered. Richard stared at the thin stripes of light on the floor until they blurred. "We're going to talk," he said at last. "But you need to know there is anger inside me. Not a little, a lot." Her answer was almost a breath. "I know." She started with the night he remembered, but from a different angle. He had recalled shouting and a slammed door. She recalled a whisper and footsteps in the hallway, the way the walls carried the neighbors' arguments, like tin. She had tried to keep the apartment quiet, tried to keep him asleep. It hadn't worked. "There were people who owed money," she said, fingers worrying the edge of the blanket. "Not me, not directly, but debt doesn't respect fences. It spreads. They came looking for someone who wasn't there. They told me they'd be back. I packed a bag. I planned to leave with you at dawn and go where your aunt lived." Richard tried to picture his old bed, tried to imagine the bag by the door that he had never seen. "You didn't." "I did," she said. "Then I got followed. A pause. And I got scared. The words were simple, almost unbearably so. I thought if I disappeared for a week, they'd stop circling. I left you with the neighbor and her mother. Remember Mrs. Keene? I paid her. I wrote down the number for your aunt. I was supposed to be gone 2 days. His jaw tightened. You were gone 3 decades. I was gone because I was taken on a bus out of the city, then another. I was taken without papers. People call it 1,000 things when it happens to strangers. I call it getting swallowed. After that, there were shelters, kitchens, motels, strange names I wore like coats. Illness finished the job. The doctor called it transient global amnesia. It sounds like a bad movie. It felt like being erased 1 minute at a time. Richard pressed his fingertips to his eyes. The image of her strolling away had fed him for years. The image of her being carried by events larger than them scissored through the old narrative and left nothing neat behind. He breathed slowly, counting the seconds, waiting for balance to return. What about the neighbor? My father. Anyone? I left notes, she said. Your father burned what he didn't like. He thought I made him small. Maybe I did. I went back 3 times before everything broke. After the amnesia, it was faces without names, places without coordinates. She managed eye contact again. I didn't abandon you. I drowned. Richard sat back, shoulders against the chair, staring at the blinds. He wasn't a boy anymore. He could pass risk, systems, cause and effect. What he couldn't pass was the way anger and mercy could occupy the same square inch of a human chest. He exhaled through his nose. Okay, he said, and surprised himself that he meant it. Okay is not forgiveness. It's just a door left open. The mind bargains with the past. It sands down edges, files away splinters, trades precision for stories that let you sleep. Richard's story had been efficient. She left. He hardened. He won. But the new details made old scenes glitch and reassemble. He remembered the flashing red and blue in the alley that night, the smear of color on the kitchen ceiling when the patrol car idled outside. He remembered the neighbor's mother, Mrs. Keene, lowering her voice and tucking him into the couch with a scratchy blanket that smelled like mothballs and cinnamon. He remembered a man's shadow on the wall. He had always cast that shadow as his father. Maybe it had been someone else. He also remembered hands, his mother's, moving fast, gathering bread, canned beans, a photo in a cracked frame. He remembered her whisper, "If anybody knocks, you don't open. You sing, loud." At 12, he had thought it was a game. At 42, he heard it for what it was, a plan drafted under pressure. In the private room, he stood and walked to the window. The parking lot carried the afternoon like a tired secret. A van with a dented bumper, a tree that had learned to grow sideways to catch the light. For a man who owned towers, he felt a sudden respect for things that persisted without being seen. His mother's voice came softer. I tried to send letters when the fog lifted. They came back with stamps I didn't understand. I kept one. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a thin envelope, edges frayed, corners curled. The address was the building where he had not lived in 20 years. On the back, a return address that was more a suggestion than a place. Richard handled the envelope like glass. His name written in small, neat strokes made his skin prickle. He imagined a postal clerk somewhere turning it over, shrugging, dropping it into a bin marked undeliverable. The mechanics of fate carried out with total indifference. What did you do with the rest of your life? He asked, not unkindly. Little things, she said. A church kitchen in Ohio, an orchard one summer, a library where the librarian let me shelve the books wrong until I learned the order again, and a place where I learned to sleep through other people's storms. She lifted her eyes. I kept looking for you, even when I didn't know your name. Richard let the blinds slap softly against the window frame. The room didn't feel smaller, he did, which, to his surprise, felt like relief. Richard stepped into the hallway and asked for the director. The man arrived too quickly, smoothing his tie as if authority were a garment that wrinkled under stress. Richard requested her file. The director hesitated, then nodded. There were forms, privacy protocols. Richard signed without reading, the way he did when instinct outran caution. The file wasn't thick. People without documents rarely generate a lot of paperwork. A single intake form listed an arrival date 2 years ago. The name on the first line was Evelyn Hale, with the question mark boxed in pencil. There were notes about a fall, a concussion, a hospital social worker who made a dozen calls to places that had no answers. There was a photo clipped to the inside cover. His mother, 3 pounds thinner, eyes wary, chin tilted up like someone refusing to disappear. Who brought her here? Richard asked. A paramedic, the director said. Found her near the bus depot. She had a small bag with a sweater and that envelope you're holding. She kept saying she had to get to a building that doesn't exist anymore. Richard closed the file gently. He felt a heat rise that wasn't anger and wasn't shame, something newer and therefore dangerous. What does she owe? The director blinked. Owe for her care. For what she'll need. The director named a figure that would frighten a family and amuse a hedge fund. Richard didn't smile. It's covered, he said. And not just covered. This place needs a new generator. The elevator stalls between floors. The roof. He gestured toward the ceiling, where a water stain shaped like a map of a country no longer recognized had spread into the corners. The roof is a problem. I'll fix the problems. The director looked at him with a complicated expression, gratitude tangled with suspicion. The rich arrive with checks. They also arrive with conditions. There will be procedures, he said carefully. There will be people who don't have to sleep in the hall when the power goes out. Richard answered. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he re-entered the room, his mother stared at the file in his hands as if it were a trap. He set it aside and pulled his chair closer. I'm not paying to erase anything, he said. I'm paying so you don't disappear again. She nodded, tears gathering but not falling. You always argued with logic, she murmured, a faint smile trying on old muscles. Even as a boy, he almost smiled back, almost. Even good news has sharp corners. Richard felt them as he spoke, resolve cutting through the soft ache in his chest. He had thought for years that forgiveness was a performance, a speech delivered at the end of a third act. In this room, it looked more like a set of small, stubborn decisions. I need truth, he said. All of it. Even if it makes me hate you for a while. I can take the hate, she said. I lived with the echo anyway. He inhaled and let it out slowly. I blamed you for the person I became. The person you became built things, she replied. The person I became survived them. Her eyes flicked to the file. Survival is not noble. It's just what lived bodies do when there's no script. They sat with that until the air in the room felt breathable again. A nurse named Kayla knocked softly, offered tea, left without hovering. The ordinary act of a paper cup being placed on a bedside table felt like a bridge back to the world. Richard rubbed his temples. I told stories about you, he said. To myself. To investors who asked why I worked like sleep was a rumor. My mother left, I'd say, as if it explained the engine under my ribs. It did, in a way. But not the way I meant. What way do you mean now? He searched for precise words and chose simpler ones. I found fuel in a wound. She nodded, the motion tiny but decisive. Then we cauterize it, she said. Not by pretending it was nothing. By deciding what it isn't anymore. She lifted her hand and after a moment's hesitation rested it on his knuckles. Her skin was tissue thin, warm, where moments earlier it had felt cold. I'm sorry, she said. There isn't a form of those words that fixes 30 years. But if you need them, I have them. Richard stared at their hands. He had signed deals across tables that cost more than this entire building. Nothing had felt this expensive. I need them, he said. And I'm not a good man because I say that. I'm just a man who's tired. Then rest, she murmured. Not from work. From the story that kept you working. Outside, a lawnmower started, droned, moved away. Richard let the sound wash through the room. He understood that forgiveness, if it arrived, would arrive the way the mower's hum did, then fade, then return, then falter again. He could live with that. He squeezed her hand once, not a promise, not a vow, just an agreement to keep the door open. We're not finished, he said. No, she agreed. But we're finally on the right page. Night fell quickly outside the nursing home. The blinds framed strips of darkness, and the fluorescent light above buzzed with a faint, stubborn hum. Richard stayed in the chair, hands clasped as his mother drifted into fragments of memory. "Your father wasn't cruel at first," she said, staring at the window as if the glass itself carried the old scenes. "But the anger grew. It grew like mold. One day it spread to you. I couldn't stand by. I thought I could shield you. But shielding turned into running, and running turned into getting lost." Richard felt the words cut through him. He remembered nights when doors slammed, when a man's voice broke through the walls like a hammer. He remembered covering his ears, wishing for silence. He had blamed his mother for that silence never coming. Now he understood she had tried. The air in the room thickened. His chest ached with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "Why didn't you fight harder?" His voice cracked despite his effort to keep it sharp. Her eyes finally turned to him. "Because I was scared, and because I didn't know how to win. Some battles aren't about who's stronger. They're about who survives long enough to crawl out the other side." Richard leaned back, staring at the ceiling tiles, each one a square grid of monotony. He wondered how many people had sat under these lights, telling stories of survival that no one outside these walls would ever hear. For the first time, he realized his mother wasn't just a missing piece of his story. She had her own story, jagged and unfinished, written in shadows he had never dared to read. Richard stood and paced the room. His $4,000 suit looked out of place against the pale linoleum, his polished shoes squeaking with each step. He had always prided himself on control, on never letting emotions dictate his moves. Yet here control was useless. "You know what 30 years does to a person?" he said, voice rising. "I built walls. Skyscrapers, companies, empires. Also, I'd never need anyone again. Every headline, every deal. I was proving I didn't need you." She didn't flinch. She sat steady, her frail body wrapped in the blanket, eyes calm. "And did it work?" The question lodged in his throat. He thought about the penthouse apartment filled with art no one touched, the dinners eaten alone, the staff who smiled because they were paid to. He thought about the awards on his shelves, each one polished but hollow. "No," he admitted at last. "It didn't work." Silence settled between them, heavier than any argument. For the first time, Richard felt the armor he had carried for decades begin to crack, and he wasn't sure if what lay underneath was anger, grief, or something far more dangerous, the need to forgive. A nurse entered briefly, checked vitals, then left with a polite nod. The door closed, and Richard's mother whispered, "You've carried me like a ghost all these years." But ghosts aren't meant to be carried. Richard sank back into the chair, hands gripping the armrests. "You don't get to tell me what I carried. You don't get to show up after 30 years and decide what this means." His voice cracked raw. "I was a boy. I needed a mother." I got silence, her face twisted with pain. "And I can't change that. I can only tell you the silence wasn't chosen. It was stolen. They stole years from me and from you. I hate it as much as you do." Richard's breathing grew uneven. He had shouted at competitors, at CEOs, at senators. But shouting at this frail woman felt like punching smoke. All the rage came back at him, leaving him hollow. Finally, he lowered his head into his hands. The tears he had resisted since childhood finally broke through. They were quiet, untheatrical, raw. His mother reached out slowly, her hand trembling as it brushed his arm. For a moment, they stayed like that. Broken son, broken mother. 30 years of fractures between them. The staff tried to give them privacy, but whispers slipped through the hallway. Other residents had noticed the strange reunion. Some lingered at the doorway, pretending to adjust walkers or sip tea, but really listening, watching. To them, it wasn't just Richard Hale, the billionaire. It was a man confronting his past in real time. And the sight of it, of wealth stripped bare in the face of family, moved them in ways no donation ever could. One old man leaned on his cane and muttered to another, "Money doesn't buy back years." The other nodded, eyes glassy. Inside the room, Richard noticed the eyes peeking in, and for once he didn't feel anger at being observed. Instead, he felt exposed in a way that was oddly freeing. He wasn't Hale, the empire builder. He wasn't Hale, the ruthless negotiator. He was just Richard, the boy who lost his mother, now finding her again, and strangely, letting others witness it made the weight lighter. As the evening deepened, Richard stood and walked toward the door. His mother's hand caught his wrist, surprisingly firm for someone so fragile. "You'll come back?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed fear, the fear of being abandoned once again. Richard looked down at her hand, then back at her face. For years, he had told himself he didn't need family, that the only promises worth making were signed in ink and enforced by lawyers. But this was different. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll come back, tomorrow, and the day after." Her shoulders eased, tears sliding freely now. "That's all I need to hear," Richard nodded. For once, he didn't feel the need to control the future. He didn't need to know how the story would end. It was enough to know it wasn't ending tonight. As he stepped into the hallway, the director approached cautiously. "Mr. Hale, I've never seen anything like that." Richard didn't answer. He only adjusted his tie, wiped the corner of his eye with the back of his hand, and whispered to himself, "Neither have I." The limousine pulled away from the nursing home, its tires whispering against the asphalt as the city lights blurred into streaks across the tinted windows. Richard Hale leaned back into the leather seat, but no comfort reached him. The silence of the car was too clean, too artificial. His thoughts, however, were messy, chaotic fragments colliding inside his skull. He loosened his tie, something he rarely did in public, and pressed his fingers against his temples. The face of his mother, older, thinner, fragile, lingered in his vision no matter how tightly he shut his eyes. He had seen her across a crowded hall, had touched her hand, had heard her voice break through decades of silence. And now, despite his fortune, despite the empire built on concrete and steel, he felt small. Smaller than the boy who once cried himself to sleep in a half-lit apartment 30 years ago. "Home, sir?" his driver asked through the partition. Richard stared out at the city skyline, at towers he owned, their mirrored glass catching the glow of neon and moonlight. He thought of all the nights he had stood at the top of those towers, believing the world belonged to him. Tonight, those towers looked like hollow monuments. He shook his head. "No, just drive." The limousine drifted through neighborhoods Richard hadn't visited since childhood. They had changed, yet something in their bones remained the same. The glow of diners where families crowded into booths, children pressing their noses against glass cases of pies. Laundromats where fluorescent lights flickered above rows of whirring machines. Small corner stores still guarded by bells that jingled when the door opened. Richard watched through the glass as if studying a foreign country. This was the life he had left behind, the life he pretended no longer existed. But seeing his mother again had broken that illusion. She had lived in places like this, maybe even smaller, more forgotten. He could almost picture her walking down a cracked sidewalk, coat too thin for winter, searching for a place that would let her sleep. The car rolled to a stop at a traffic light. Across the street, an old playground leaned under the weight of rust. The swings creaked in the cold breeze. For a moment, Richard remembered being pushed by his mother on a swing, just like that, her laugh rising with his, her hands steady against his back. The memory was sharp and sudden, so vivid he almost reached for the door handle to step out, to feel the ground where he once believed the world was safe. The light changed, and the limousine pulled forward. Richard exhaled, long and shaky. "Should I take you to the penthouse, Mr. Hale?" The driver asked again, cautious this time. Richard didn't answer. He pressed his forehead to the cool glass, watching the reflection of his face slide across the city. A man in his 40s, wealthy beyond measure, but tonight he looked like a boy searching the crowd for his mother. Finally he spoke, voice low. "Drive to the old neighborhood." The driver hesitated but obeyed. Soon they were weaving through streets narrower, darker, less polished. Richard felt something in his chest tighten. He hadn't been here in decades. The apartment building where he grew up was gone, replaced by a gray parking lot with faded lines. He stepped out of the car, despite the driver's warning about safety. The night air was cold, carrying the smell of oil and damp concrete. Richard stood in the lot, staring at nothing and everything. Once this was home. Once there had been walls that held his mother's humming, a stove that baked bread, a radio that played static between songs. All gone now, erased. He crouched down, touched the cracked pavement. The silence pressed against him. She looked for this place, he whispered to himself. She came back here. And it wasn't here anymore. The thought gutted him. He imagined her, confused, standing in this lot with the envelope in her pocket, whispering his name to buildings that no longer existed. The idea that she had returned and found only absence made his throat close. The driver stepped closer. "Sir, it's late." Richard rose slowly, brushing the dust from his hand. He gave the parking lot one last look. "Take me home," he said, voice flat. But as the limousine carried him back toward the glittering towers of the city, Richard realized that home was no longer his penthouse, no longer the skyscrapers with his name on the deeds. For the first time, home was a nursing home room with pale blinds, where a frail woman had whispered his name after 30 years, and he knew, as the city lights blurred again, that he would not sleep tonight. Perhaps he would never sleep the same way again. Richard arrived before the sun could find the edges of the buildings. The nursing home sat quiet in the blue hour, its brick facade washed in a color that made everything look cleaner than it was. Sprinklers clicked somewhere on the lawn, tossing thin silver arcs across patches of tired grass. Through the glass doors, a receptionist lifted her head, startled, then nodded, as if a billionaire at dawn was an ordinary part of her shift. He carried small things, a plain paper bag from a bakery that still trusted morning traffic, and a dented thermos he'd pulled from the back of a cupboard where gifts from long-ago sponsors went to hibernate. No cameras, no assistant, no driver hovering with the door. Just Richard. Tie loosened, sleeves rolled to the forearms, hair imperfect in a way it never was on television. "Good morning," he said. His voice surprised him. It sounded human. "Good morning, Mr. Hale." The receptionist checked a chart, then caught herself. "She's awake most mornings before any of us." "Room 214. He thanked her and moved down the corridor, each step measured, not rehearsed. The hall lights buzzed faintly, the kind of sound you stop noticing once you live with it. Bulletin boards displayed flyers for bingo, a visiting choir, a vaccination clinic on Thursday. On a side table, a jigsaw puzzle waited for more sky pieces. He paused, touched a cardboard edge, then kept walking. At 2:14, he knocked lightly and pushed the door open with his shoulder. The room was dim but not sad. A thin line of dawn slipped between the blinds and fell across the floor like a ribbon. She sat in the chair by the window, cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, spine straight with the pride of someone who refuses to let a chair teach her how to sit. She turned. The smile didn't rush. It built like warmth gathering in a cold room. "You came back. I said I would." He held up the bag. "You used to say the best bread is gone before the first complaint of the day." "That sounds like me," she said, with a softness he remembered in the bones, if not in his memory. "You brought coffee." He nodded, set everything on the tray table, unscrewed the thermos cap that doubled as a cup. He poured carefully, the liquid making that hopeful sound coffee always makes in the morning. He passed her the cup and poured his own into a paper cup from the bathroom. Indignities of wealth weren't a concern here. "Still hate it?" he asked. "I hate the bitterness," she said, "but I love the heat." She took a cautious sip and winced, then smiled through it. "That was always true about you, too." He sliced the bread with a plastic knife, not because it cut well, but because precision felt necessary. Steam rose from the torn interior. He placed a piece on a napkin and slid it to her, then took a smaller piece for himself. They ate in a silence that didn't demand to be filled. After a minute, he said, "I used to pretend I liked black coffee. Thought it made me look older." "You were 8, she said. He laughed. A real sound, the kind that knocked something loose in his chest. 8 and tired of being small. "You were never small," she said, not as a compliment, just as a fact. "You were loud when you needed to be, and quiet when you learned it moved the world more." They ate a little more. The room breathed with them. Radiator clanging once, a cart squeaking down the hall, a bird testing a single note on the other side of the window. Richard wiped his fingers on the napkin. then folded it in half, then half again, then smaller still, until he realized he was buying time. "I went to the old neighborhood last night," he said. She set the cup down. "Anne, it's a parking lot," he said. "Painted lines where rooms used to be." She closed her eyes. He watched the lids flutter like film passing through a projector. "I knew that," she whispered. "But I didn't know it until you said it," he nodded. "I stood there anyway, tried to decide which square of asphalt was our kitchen. Which corner was your radio? I remembered that song you hummed when you didn't want me to hear you worry." "Skylark," she said, smiling without opening her eyes. "Yeah," he said, surprised at how quickly the title arrived. Skylark? They let the words sit between them? It felt like a promise they'd made without knowing. "Do you want the truth?" she asked quietly. "I didn't come for anything else. I almost didn't come back here," she said. "When things started returning, I was afraid the part that would come back next would be the worst one. That I'd remember leaving and not the reason why. Memory isn't a filing cabinet, it's a tide. It brings what it wants." She took another small sip. "But the tide brought your face first. So I followed that." He turned the thermos cap in his hands, slow clicks marking seconds he couldn't keep in any other way. "I told myself a story," he said. "That you left because of me. Not because anyone said it. Because it made sense to a boy who needed a reason. And the story worked," she said. "Until it didn't. It worked the way a cast works," he said. "It lets the bone knit, but if you wear it forever, the muscle dies." She nodded once. "Then we take the cast off?" They didn't say forgive or forget. They didn't negotiate terms or dress the moment up with vows. They ate bread from a paper bag and drank coffee out of mismatched cups. The sun lifted. The ribbon of light on the floor widened and slid, slow and certain, across the room. A nurse named Kayla tapped the door and peeked in. "Vitals, Miss Hale?" "Come in," Richard said, stepping back. Kayla wrapped the cuff around Evelyn's arm, checked the monitor, made a note on a tablet. "You're earlier than the early birds, Mr. Hale." "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Then you're in the right place," Kayla replied. "We collect the insomniacs and give them something to do." She winked and slipped out, letting the door hush itself closed. Evelyn looked at him. "She's kind. They all are," he said. "Oh, they're learning to be. I told the director I'd fix the roof, and the generator, and that elevator that thinks floors are suggestions. You don't have to buy their kindness," she said. "I'm buying time," he said, "for people who need less water in their ceilings when it rains." She considered that, then accepted it with a small nod. "Practical mercy," she said. "It suits you." He stood and drew the blinds a little higher. The window revealed a maple tree with a habit of growing sideways. Hungry for an angle of light, the building refused to surrender. A pair of starlings hopped across the thin grass, complaining about something in a language that didn't require translation. "Come sit by the window," he said. "If you're up to it." She rose carefully, and he steadied her with a hand under her elbow. "Bones under skin, light as a story told too long ago." He hated that thought and replaced it with another, bones under skin, strong enough to come back. They watched the day arrive. Somewhere a delivery truck groaned. A bus whispered to a stop and hissed its doors. The world conducted its reliable orchestra, indifferent and comforting. "Tell me something I don't know about you," she said. He thought. The versions the press knew were too loud. The versions investors knew were too sharp. "I learned to cook," he said. She startled, delighted. "When?" "When I realized I was hiring people to feed me and couldn't tell them what I wanted," he said. "I can't make bread like this, but I can make a stew that doesn't apologize. I want to taste it," she said. "You will." "And you?" he asked. "Tell me something I don't know." "I can name the trees in the courtyard," she said. "The maple by the window, 2 lindens near the entrance, 1 ash that's trying very hard not to be noticed. I worked in a library for 6 months. The librarian taught me classification. It sticks, even when other things don't," he smiled. "Of course it does." They sat until the light made everything obvious, the scuffs in the floor, the hairline crack in the ceiling paint, the way her cardigan had lost a button and kept the absence like a badge. Ordinary things, treasured things. When he finally stood to leave, it wasn't because he wanted to. It was because the day insisted. Responsibilities would not politely excuse themselves. He tightened the lid on the thermos and placed it on the shelf by the TV. "I'll be back this afternoon," he said. "Come when you can," she said, then added, "But come." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. The gesture felt new and old at once. A bridge thrown across a gap that used to look unjumpable. He stepped into the hallway, took 2 paces, then turned back, embarrassed by his own caution. "Do you need anything?" he asked. "Just more mourning," she said. He nodded. "I'll bring it with me." When he reached the lobby, the receptionist glanced up again, this time with a small wave that belonged to neighbors, not headlines. Outside, the day had finally arrived. Richard breathed it in like a first decision. The visits became routine, though nothing about them felt ordinary. Each morning, Richard arrived earlier, often before the staff had finished their first round of check-ins. He brought simple things: apples from a market, a crossword puzzle book, a newspaper folded under his arm. He had never read a newspaper without skimming the business section first. Now he found himself pausing on human interest stories, reading them aloud to his mother as if rehearsing empathy. The other residents noticed. At first they whispered, their eyes following him as if he were a celebrity intruding on their fragile ecosystem. But soon, curiosity softened into acceptance. He wasn't only the man on television anymore. He was the son who came back every day. One afternoon, Evelyn insisted he join the group in the common room. "You sit alone with me too much," she said. "You need to hear other lives, or you'll think ours is the only one that matters." Reluctantly, Richard followed her. So, common room smelled faintly of disinfectant and instant coffee, but it also held laughter. A piano stood in the corner, its wood dulled by decades of polish. An old man named Harris tapped out a slow tune, missing notes but filling the gaps with charm. Richard sat awkwardly at first, arms crossed. Then a woman with a crocheted shawl leaned toward him. "You look like my son," she said. Though her eyes suggested she no longer remembered his name, Richard didn't correct her. "Tell me about him," he said. And she did, haltingly, pieces at a time, about a boy who once built her a birdhouse, about the way he hated thunderstorms. Richard listened, nodding, and for the first time in years, he let someone else's story hold the room. When Harris finished his song, Evelyn clapped softly. Richard joined her, the sound of his hands echoing louder than he intended. He noticed how his mother's shoulders lifted when he clapped, as though his approval filled a space she thought would always be empty. Later, walking her back to her room, Richard admitted, "I don't belong here. I don't know how to be part of this." She squeezed his arm gently. "Belonging isn't something you're handed. It's something you practice." That night, Richard replayed the words in his head. For years, he had practiced isolation, wealth as a shield. Now, for the first time, he wondered what it meant to practice belonging. It couldn't stay private forever. One staff member mentioned the reunion to a cousin, who mentioned it to a reporter. By the end of the week, headlines appeared. "Billionaire Hale reunites with mother after 30 years. From boardroom to nursing home, the story no money could buy. Cameras gathered outside the gates. Paparazzi shouted his name whenever he arrived. His PR team panicked, demanding statements, rehearsed interviews, damage control. Richard ignored them. He had spent his life controlling narratives, but this one belonged to no spin doctor. It belonged to him and Evelyn. When the press cornered him one afternoon, shouting questions as he left the building, Richard stopped. He looked directly at the lenses, at the sea of microphones, and said only, "I found my mother. That's the only fortune that matters." The clip spread across networks and social media. For once, the comments weren't cynical. Strangers wrote about their own mothers, their regrets, their hopes. Some admitted crying. Others wrote, "He looks like a man, not a machine." Inside, Evelyn saw the clip on the common room television. Her eyes brimmed with tears she didn't bother to hide. "You spoke like yourself," she told him later. "Not like a company." Richard shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I just said the truth. Truth is rare, she said. That's why it matters. The press kept circling, but Richard stopped caring. For the first time, his reputation wasn't something he managed. It was something he lived. Change arrived slowly, like rain soaking into dry ground. Richard funded repairs, yes. The roof sealed, the generator replaced, fresh paint brightening the halls. But the deeper change came in his presence. He joined. Meals in the cafeteria, sitting at long tables, where residents teased each other about who cheated at bingo. He listened to stories about childhood farms, about first loves lost in wars, about daughters who never called. He carried trays, fetched water, even fixed a stubborn television antenna one afternoon. The staff noticed. "You're different," Kayla the nurse told him one evening. "I should have been different years ago," he admitted. With Evelyn, the promise took root in small gestures. He learned her medication schedule, reminded her to drink water, brought her books with large print. He read aloud when her eyes tired, his voice steady even when the words blurred with emotion. One evening, as the sun burned orange across the courtyard, Evelyn took his hand. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "I told you I would." "And when I'm gone?" she asked, her gaze searching his face. Richard swallowed hard. "Then I'll keep it anyway. I'll keep living like this mattered." She smiled, lines deepening around her eyes. "That's all a mother can ask." In that moment, Richard understood that wealth wasn't towers or titles. Wealth was presence. Wealth was showing up again and again until the people who doubted your return believed in it. The day came quietly. Evelyn's chair by the window stood empty, her blanket folded neatly across the armrest. The silence in the room was complete, the kind that expands until it fills every corner. Richard sat in the chair she had left behind, holding the old envelope with his name on it, the one that had traveled nowhere for decades. He traced the faded ink with his finger, imagining the younger version of her writing it, hoping it would find him. She was gone, but not the way she had been before. This time she left him full, not hollow. She left him with stories, with rituals, with mornings that stitched 30 years of silence back into something whole. When Richard rose, the staff and residents lined the hall. Some clapped softly, others bowed their heads. He walked through them slowly, not as a billionaire, not as a headline, but as a son who had found his mother, and in doing so had found himself outside. The city towers glittered, monuments to his ambition. But for the first time, he saw them differently, not as trophies, but as backdrops. The real wealth had been waiting in a nursing home room with blinds that hummed when the wind touched them. Looking up at the skyline, Richard whispered, "I was never rich until now," and with that, he stepped forward, not into the past he had lost, but into the future his mother's return had given him.